All right, I will say good morning and a good Chodesh to everyone. Begin by thanking our sponsors. So first of all, thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Cheshvan. To thank Meir and Rachel Gold for dedicating all of the shiurim and drushos this month in the zechus of their mishpacha. We truly appreciate their sponsorship, and halavai, Be'ez Hashem, they should be zocher to see beautiful nachas ledore doros. We thank our week of learning sponsors, Avraham and Sean Elbaum, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drushos this week in memory of, in the zechus of Refuah Shalema for Ami Ben Chaya. And our Daf Yomi sponsor today, the TA class of 1971, in commemoration of the 50th yahrzeit of their classmate, Morris Sandler, Moshe Yehuda ben Avraham Kelman Family. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah. There's not even a family, unfortunately. You know, those of us who have been in the shul for a little while know the story of Morris Sandler, Zichron Livracha, Baruch Fishel, and the rest of the Chevra really works so hard to perpetuate his memory. And it's an incredible schus to be able to dedicate today's daf. We hope that in the merit of our learning, his neshama has an aliyah. He enjoys a licht gan eden liolam va'ed. So with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Lamed Zayin 37, and we are picking up in Yahrzeit Hashem. We got through the Mishnah. So remember again, just to orient ourselves in the Mishnah spoke about three categories of things that we do not do on Shabbos. That we do not do on, it's things that you can't do on Shabbos, you also can't do on Yom Tiv. The three categories of things were what you call a Shavus, a Rishos, and a Mitzvah. So the way we're going to define those categories now, though the Gemara is going to challenge that, is that a Shavus is something that is Asr Midrabanan. A Rishos is something that is also Asr Midrabanan, but has a quasi-mitzvah element to it, and mitzvah is a mitzvah. The common denominator amongst all of these things is that they're all asr, right? You cannot do them on Shabbos, the Gemara says, as well as on Yom Tov. So we'll say now we're going to go through all of these cases, and there's a lot of really interesting halacha in some of these cases. Let me just make sure we're up and running over here. Okay. Good. So says the Gemara, Ein lo olin be'ilan, you're not allowed to climb a tree. Why can't they climb a tree? Says the Gemara. Gzeira shema yitlosh. So we'll say, remember again, the lashon of the Mishnah was b'Shabbos chayav and Allah. Mishum mitzvah b'Shabbos chayav and Allah b'Yom Tov. All of these things apply on Shabbos as well as on Yom Tov. So number one, lo olam b'ilan. You can't climb a tree. Why not? Gzeira shema yitlosh. Out of a concern that you may come to detach a branch. Good. V'lo rochen al gabi behema. You can't ride an animal on Shabbos. Gzeira shema yetzei chutz letchum. Out of a concern that you may come to leave the tchum. Now this is very interesting, says the Gemara, Shmamina. Now I will say, now remember, if Chazal are going to legislate and say you can't ride an animal, lest you come to leave the tchum, that must mean that what? Shmamina, tchumin daraisa. That would tell us that tchumin, the concept of tchum, is daraisa. Now remember again, why does it have to be that way? Because Chazal aren't going to legislate an isser in order to safeguard an Isser D'Rabbanan. That would be called a trade D'Rabbanan, right? Or Gzera al Gzera, which we don't do. So the fact that Chazal are legislating this must mean that Tchumin D'Oraisa. Now, of course, that's very interesting because generally we paskin, we assume Tchumin are D'Rabbanan. To which the Gemara says, Ella Gzera Shema Yachtoch Zmura. Rather, why can't you go ahead and ride an animal on Shabbos? Ultimately, again, out of a concern that you may come to detach a branch. For what purpose? For the purpose of whipping the animal. Right? Whipping the animal. Good. Next, for lo shatan al pnei hamayim, you can't swim on Shabbos. So I'll say, this is very interesting. Why can't you swim on Shabbos? So the Gemara says, Shema ya'aseh chavis shal shayatin. Rashi says, what does it mean, chavis? Now, chavis shal shayatin literally means a barrel of swimmers. Now, what does that mean? It says Rashi, Kli shel guma she'argin also, va'osin kamin chavis aruka, ulemedin ba'lasher. It's a flotation device. Chazal said you can't swim on Shabbos lest you come to construct a flotation device. Now, what's very interesting over here is as follows. Rashi says, what's the issue with constructing a flotation device? So according to Rashi, there are two potential malachas. Malacha number one is she'argin also. You're weaving it, right? So the act of weaving on Shabbos. is an av malacha, oreg is an av malacha, right? Furthermore, again, there's tikkun kli, or tikkun mana. Constructing of a vessel is also an isser on Shabbos. According to Rashi, there's ariga and tikkun kli. Tosas is just interesting. Tosas says Shema Yaseh Chavish Shal Shayatin. So if you look at the end of that Tosas, he says Lachin Yirali Shukli Cheres. Tosas just disagrees on the mitzias of this kli, and according to Rashi, this was fashioned out of woven reeds. Tosas understands it to be an earthenware vessel, a hollow earthenware vessel which would float. Again, only difference is that according to Tosas, there's only one Isser Daraisa. Right? There's only one Isser. According to Rashi, there's two Isurim. But Lamaisa, again, the issue, the Gzeira is the same, that ultimately one will come to construct a Kli on Shabbos, and therefore, again, you're not allowed to swim. Important halacha. There are other issues associated with swimming on Shabbos, which have to do with schitas seyar, or ultimately, again, schita of a towel. But lamaisa, again, remember, there's a number of different prohibitions, but the Gemara chooses over here to associate with chavish shal shayatin. Good. V'lo metapkin, v'lo mesapkin, v'lo muraktin. So these we've had before. You cannot clap, you cannot dance. Right? To remember again, there's mesapkin with hand against hand, there's hand against one's leg. So the Gemara says, Gzer shem yitakin kleshir. And this is a concern lest one come to go ahead and construct an instrument. Remember again, we already saw Tosas a few dapim ago who said, and I will say this gets into, remember I mentioned this when we learned the sugya beforehand, how it's interesting that certain gzeros, the Gemara felt comfortable, the Rishonim felt comfortable, are no longer a concern. So, for example, clapping and dancing is a perfect example. Remember again, Tosas said, today no one knows how to construct an instrument, so it's not really an issue. So one could probably make the same argument by flotation devices. But Lamais, again, you see, and again, this is a much more in-depth topic, not for our Daf Yomi Shir in the morning, but there are different Dinei D'Rabbanan that are constructed in different ways. In any event, we go weiter. So the Gemara says, Ve'elu v'heim mishum rishus. And I will say now we come to the next category. These are the things that are asr als rishus. So I will say, remember again, the first category was shavus, which means non-mitzvah activities prohibited, and again we've seen because they may lead to malacha. Next category are what we call rishus. Rishus are things that have a quasi-mitzvah identity associated with them. What are the things of rishus? Lo danin. So number one, you can't judge. The Gemara says, I have a mitzvah kavid. They will say it is a mitzvah to judge. Now, let's interpret that correctly, right? What does it mean it's a mitzvah to judge, right? It means if you're a dayan and you're adjudicating a case, the act of adjudicating a legal dispute is a mitzvah. They will say, listen to how profound this Gemara is. Lo tzricha di'ika da'adif minei. They will say, when do you sit in judgment? If you're the smartest guy in the room. But if you're not the smartest guy in the room, there is no mitzvah of judgment. I will say, what an incredible way to approach life. First of all, always approach life, you're never the smartest guy in the room. And if you think you're the smartest guy in the room, that's even a greater proof that you're not the smartest guy in the room. Don't judge unless you're the smartest guy in the room. Because at the end of the day, judgment is so dangerous. Because you never have all the details. Because you never have the full story. Sometimes do you have to judge? Sometimes do you have to make a judgment about a situation, a judgment about another person? Sometimes you have to. But when do you do that? When do you do that? When there's no one who's adif minei. When there's no one who's smarter than me. If there's someone who's smarter than me, maybe ask for Beitzah. Maybe ask for guidance before I go ahead and I have a profound idea. When is it a mitzvah to judge? When you're the smartest person. But if you're not the smartest person, if you're not the most qualified individual, perhaps better to reserve judgment, especially about others. Incredible yisod. The Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, So v'lo makachin, we don't go ahead and get married, right? We don't do kiddushin. V'ha mitzvah ka'avid. But isn't marriage a mitzvah? Lo tzricha top of lamed zayin di'ika le di'isle isha ubanim. What are we talking about? Where a person has children. Rashi says over the Isle Isho Banim, Shnei Zuchram leBeis Shammai, either two boys according to Beis Shammai, O Zarcha Unekeva leBeis Hillel, and a boy and a girl according to Beis Hillel, V'su lo mifgad kulei hai, ki da'aminan bi'avamis, umiya ktsas mitzvah ika, So it's very interesting. So the Gemara says over here, when we say that ultimately, again, we don't do Kiddushin. So what is this talking about? Isn't Kiddushin a mitzvah? So it's interestingly enough, the Gemara takes the approach that marriage is a hechsher mitzvah. Marriage by itself is not a mitzvah. Marriage is a hechsher. Marriage is a facilitator for a mitzvah because it allows a person to have children, bikidusha ubetara. And therefore, again, the mitzvah only applies if a person has not, quote unquote, fulfilled the mitzvah. When does a person fulfill the mitzvah? Well, for period of arivia, mitzvah, machlokes Yeshan Beis, 2 boys or 1 boy and 1 girl. Rashi just points out, even after one fulfills the mitzvah period of arivia, there's a mitzvah of sheves. The mitzvah of sheves is generally populating the world, right? Which is the mitzvah to continue to have a family even after one has fulfilled the core obligation. In any event, the point the Gemara is making over here is that halacha l'maisa, it could be that we're discussing a case of Kiddushin where Kiddushin isn't a mitzvah, right? When is Kiddushin not a mitzvah? When a person has fulfilled the mitzvah of procreation. I will point out, again, just an interesting maramakom, there is a fascinating dispute in general about whether or not marriage is a mitzvah, right? Is marriage a hechsher mitzvah to allow for a family, or is there an inherent mitzvah in the concept of lo tov heyos ha'adam levado? It's good for a person not to be alone. Is that a mitzvah to go and get married? So I'm just pointing out, we're not dealing with it now, I'm just pointing out here, the Gemara takes it as a davar pashit, marriage is not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is pruravu, marriage is what allows, ultimately, again, for the mitzvah period, like to compare it, is not a good comparison, but you'll get it for illustration purposes. Shchita, right? It's a really bad comparison, but you understand, right? Like, is shchita a mitzvah? Is shchita a mitzvah? So, bepashtos, according to almost Orishon, the answer is no. Shchita is a hechsher mitzvah, right? In other words, the mitzvah is to eat kosher meat, right? So shchita is what allows me to go ahead. So there's a machlokes, is marriage like shchita? You understand? I don't mean it, in a mitzvah sense, right? In a halachic construct sense. So how do you view it? But again, not for today, but just interesting nevertheless. We don't do chalitza, we don't do yibum. Avraham mitzvah ka'avid. But one second, isn't that a mitzvah? Chalitza and yibum is a mitzvah. Very interesting. Umitzvah begadol liyabe. We'll say we're dealing with over here where there's an older brother. Now remember again, yibum chalitza is a situation halacha l'maisa where a man dies childless. So the halacha is that the surviving brother does yibum. Now, or chalitza for that matter. Now remember, technically speaking, the obligation for yibum and chalitza devolves upon all of the surviving brothers. The halacha is the oldest brother does it. But technically speaking, if one of the younger brothers came along and did yibum or chalitza, it's done. It's done. So the Gemara says, what are we talking about over here? Where yibum, so to speak, or chalitza is not a mitzvah, where there's an older brother, there's someone in front of me for the mitzvah. The kulu taimamai, to which the Gemara says, why are Chazal legislating? We'll say, how convenient would it be to get married on Shabbos, right? Think about that for just a moment, right? First of all, dramatically decrease the guest list because it's only people in walking distance. There's no band, there's no this, there's no that. It's a kiddush, right? How beautiful and how wonderful. So, and all of these things, they're all mitzvah things, so why can't I do them on Shabbos? To which the Gemara says, Gzeira Shema Yichtov. I will say fascinating. All of this is a concern that you may come to right. Now, what's the issue over here? Look at Rashi, Shema Yichtov. So let's go through this. Number one, you can't adjudicate legal cases. Why? Because psak din ledinin. Because remember, again, legal decisions have to be written down. So shtar erusin likidushin, marriage needs a ksuva. Shtar chalitza lecholetzes. Remember, again, a woman who's getting chalitza also wants a shtar. It's not a get, but it's the shtar chalitza. Uksuva liyivama, right? And also, or the ksuva for the yivam, which means the receipt of the ksuva. So I'll say the point over here is all of these things have documents associated with them. So we are concerned that if we allow you to do this on Shabbos, then at the end of the day you may come to it. So I'll say, so what you have over here is you can't go up on a tree because of a branch. Can't ride an animal also really because of a branch. You can't swim because you may come to construct a flotation device. You can't go ahead and issue a din. You can't get married. You can't do yibum or chalitza. Why? Gzeira Shema Yichtov. Ultimately, again, out of a concern that you may come to right. Ve'eluhein mishum mitzvah. So we'll say now there's the last category. The last category are things that are mamish mitzvah, but you still can't do them on Shabbos. What are they? Lo makdishin, velo ma'arichin, velo machrim. So also remember again, makdishin is you can't make something hektish. So that's pretty straightforward, right? Making something hektish, I can't go ahead and say this hereby belongs to hektish. Or ma'arichin, erech vow, we'll say every person has a value. What do I mean by that? The Torah assigns an objective financial value. This has nothing to do with a person's worth, so to speak. It has to do with, there's a concept of an erech vow. So I say I want to give the value of Avraham to the Beis Hamikdash. All right, well, what is that? So the Torah says, okay, so if you're a male non-smoker between the ages of 20, I'm just kidding about the non-smoking part, right? Between the ages of 20 and 60, right? This is what you are. You're a female, right? So you can't do that erechin. And ultimately, again, a cherem vow is also making something the property of the Beis Hamikdash. Why can't you do these things? This is fascinating. Gezerah mishum mekach umemkar. This is a gezerah, lest you come to engage in commercial practices. Now take a look at Rashi. What does that mean? Mishum mekach umemkar. The lemekach umemkar dami. All of these things are comparable to business transactions. How so? Shemotzi merushuso l'rishus hekdish. So we'll say, listen to this. What is mekach umemkar? At the end of the day, what's at the basis of every transaction? A change of rishus, a change of ownership, right? It goes from A to B. What happens in every single one of these situations? There's a change in ownership from A to B. Now, it happens to be true. It's going from me to the Beis Hamikdash, and that's very heilig, that's very holy. But at the end of the day, it's transactional. So Chazal said you can't do anything transactional because at the end of the day, it looks like mekach umemkar. Now, we'll say, now what's wrong with that? Mekach umemkar. We'll say, by the way, which malacha is it to engage in transactional proceedings, right? What malacha is that? So the answer is, it's not a malacha. Rather, Rashi says, Dichsiv, we learn it from the pasuk, Dichsiv, Mimtzo chafatzecha v'daber davar. Based on the pasuk Yeshayahu, where the Navi says, Mimtzo chafatzecha, that on Shabbos, you should refrain from engaging in your own pursuits, which Chazal understood to mean we don't conduct business on Shabbos. We don't talk business on Shabbos, right? We don't engage in transactions on Shabbos. And we globalize that to mean any kind of transactions, even transactions of mitzvahs. The Gemara says, Inami mekach umemkar asi lidei ksiva. Rashi then gives another possibility, that it's possible that in fact, gzera mekach umemkar is part of the gzera of ksiva. In other words, both say, why don't we engage in transactions? Because there's a concern that what's going to happen? You're going to come to write it down. But I know what you're thinking, says Rashi. But if it's a part of ksiva, isn't that a gzera l'gzera? Vim tomar havi le gzera l'gzera. I called it a trade rabbanim before. That's not the right term. Gzera l'gzera, kula chad gzerahi. It's all called one gzera. It's all called one gzera. So we'll say, so fascinating over here. So here you're not allowed to go ahead and make something hektish. You can't do an erech vow. You can't do a chirim vow. Why? Gzer mishum mekach umemkar. What's gzer mishum mekach umemkar? Two opinions in Rashi. Either there's an independent rabbinic prohibition that you can't engage in transactions. You can't engage in things that transfer items from one domain to another. Why? Based on the pasuk Yeshayahu, mimtzo chafatzecha. You can't pursue your own needs, your own transactional needs on Shabbos. Second, according to Rashi, no, this is all part of gezerah of ksiva, shema yichtov. You cannot go ahead and engage in anything transactional lest you come to paper. Now, I will say, the truth is there's so much to say about this discussion. Now, the one exception to this, interestingly enough, is in Yonei Tzedakah, right? In Yonei, actually, there's a couple of exceptions to it. In Yonei Tzedakah, you're allowed to go ahead and engage in tzedakah transactions on Shabbos, on Yom Tov. You could commit to tzedakah, even though, again, once you commit to tzedakah, that's a commitment. It's an irrevocable commitment that ultimately, again, is transactional, but that's a tzorach mitzvah. The other exception the Gemara Maseches Gittin brings down is purchasing land in Eretz Yisrael. That purchase is just such an incredible thing. That purchasing land in Eretz Yisrael is such an important thing. The Gemara says that you're actually this is the next smichas chaver zman, which if you haven't signed up yet, it's kidai, which is you're allowed to instruct a guy to draw up a real estate document to purchase land in Eretz Yisrael on Shabbos. In other words, even on Shabbos, you can explicitly instruct a nachri. So tzedakah and Eretz Yisrael are the two things that seem to be the exception to the Gezerah Mekach Memkar. Incredible. Let's go weiter. V'lo makbin Trumas and Maasros. So we'll say you can't separate out Trumas and Maasros on Shabbos, or for that matter, on Yom Tiv. Pshita. So we'll say that's obvious. Now remember again, that's obvious, right? Because we've already dealt with this extensively. What's the issue ultimately with separating out Trumas and Maasros is Tikkun Mana, Tikkun Kli, right? You're fixing something. So because you're fixing something, ultimately, again, that's problematic. To which the Gemara says, no. What's the Chiddush? Elalitna lekoin bo bayom. Rather, what we're referring to is to go ahead and to give it to the Kohen that day. In other words, I might have thought that halacha lemaisa, I can give a Kohen Trumas and Maasros that day. Rashi points out because, again, it's the Tzorech Yom Tiv. No one knows that it's Trumas and Maasros. They might just as easily think that it's a nice gift that I'm giving to the Kohen. V'hani mili peri detvili me'esmol. When can't you distribute or separate out Trumas, that's really separate out Trumas and Maasros on Shabbos and Yom Tiv? Only from produce that was tevel the day before, untithed on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yom Tiv. Ava peri detvili ha'ibna, this applies on Yom Tiv, but if something becomes tevel on Yom Tiv, for example, Kigon, Isla frushe mine chalo, mafrishino leviabino lekohen. We'll say this is incredible. This is a very important halacha. It's when the Mishnah says you can't separate Trumas and Maasros, that's not a totally true statement. In other words, on Shabbos, that is an unequivocally true statement. On Yom Tiv, that's not always true. For example, are you allowed to bake bread on Yom Tiv? Absolutely. What do you have to do when you make dough? When you make dough, you have to separate out challah. And you're allowed to do that on Yom Tiv. In other words, that since I'm allowed to go ahead and bake bread, that's ochel nefesh. So again, the prohibition of separating out Trumas and Maasros is if something was tevel on Erev Yom Tiv, you can't separate that out on Yom Tiv. But if something, so to speak, becomes tevel on Yom Tiv because it's being created on Yom Tiv, you can time. Now again, you can't take all the Trumas and Maasros necessarily, but certain things you're absolutely allowed to go ahead and separate on Yom Tiv. Bahani, so we'll say, now the Gemara says like this. The Mishnah said three categories, right? What are the three categories? So we have Shavus, Rishos, Mitzvah, right? Shavus means things that are just prohibited. Rishos, a shtickle mitzvah, right? Like a little bit of a mitzvah associated with it. And mitzvah. So the Gemara says, I don't understand the categories. V'hani mishum Rishos ika, mishum Shavus laka. V'hani mishum mitzvah ika, mishum Shavus laka. I was about to say, all of these, the Gemara says, are called a Shavus. We'll say, what does Shavus mean? What does Shavus mean? Right, rest. What does it mean halachically? Come on, you know this. An Isser D'Rabbanan. A Shavus is an Isser D'Rabbanan. So what do you mean? This is a Shavus, this is a Rishos, this is a mitzvah. They're all a Shavus, right? Meaning all of these things are Asr Midrabbanan. That is a halachic term. To which the Gemara says, you're right. I'm going to be Yitzchak, let me buy Kamar. Rabbi Yitzchak says like this. Lo mi buy Shavus grei dasa da Asr. It goes without saying that a straight out Shavus, in other words, something that Chazal said you can't do lest it lead to something else's asar. So I can't swim, I can't climb a tree, I can't ride an animal. That's just a straight out Shavus. Okay, that's obvious. Ela afilu Shavus derashus nami asar. So let's say you might have thought that no, Chazal are going to legislate on something that's like a shtick mitzvah, right? A little bit of a mitzvah, a mitzvah law, right? Chazal are going to go ahead and legislate on that because there's a little bit of an element of mitzvah there. Kamash malon, when they see a concern, they do legislate, even in a case of Rishos. The Gemara says, Ela afilu shvus de mitzvah nami. I'm sorry. V'lo mi by shvus de Rishos de aser. Ela afilu shvus de mitzvah nami aser. And furthermore, again, you might have thought that even if Chazal are going to legislate in a case of Rishos, where there's only a little bit of a mitzvah, but they certainly won't legislate in what? In a case of a mitzvah, right? In a case of a mitzvah where there's mamish, a full-blown mitzvah, kamash malan they do. So Rabbi says, so the point of the Mishnah is, you're right. Everything over here, all of these gzeras, are all called a shvus, because shvus is just a halachic term for an isser d'Rabbanan on Shabbos and Yom Tiv. But what the Mishnah is highlighting is the intriguing part, really the riveting part of this discussion, is that I understand if Chazal want to go ahead and prohibit non-mitzvah acts, like the first three in the Mishnah. The chiddush over here is that Chazal will even legislate on quasi-mitzvah acts, and the bigger chiddush is that Chazal will even tell you not to do certain mitzvos, ultimately, again, because they may lead to malacha. Quite interesting. So the Gemara says, Kol elu b'yom tov amru. All of these things were stated by Yom Tov. So we'll say, right, remember again, whatever is Asr, the Gemara says, what the Mishnah says, whatever was Asr on Shabbos, Kol Eilu b'Yom Tov Amru Kal V'Chomer b'Shabbos. So the Mishnah says, whatever is stated on Yom Tov was also said on Shabbos, because there's no difference between Yom Tov and Shabbos except Ochel Nefesh. Or Minhu, Alaska Shaila, Mashilin Derech Aruba b'Yom Tov Alo b'Shabbos. You could say, let's go back to our last sugya. You could lower produce through an opening in the roof, a skylight in the roof, on Yom Tov, but not on Shabbos. You both say, remember again, it's muktzah, right? Remember, the produce you spread out to dry on your roof is muktzah. On Yom Tov, you could push it down the skylight because it's not considered to be so much tircha. For Shabbos, remember again, I want to point out that something that is muktzah, just remember we learned this in Hilchos Muktzah, just because you're going to suffer a hefsid, a loss, is not a license to really move muktzah. So halacha l'maisa, again, you could do this on Yom Tov, but not on Shabbos. First wide line. On Rav Yosef, lo kash. So we'll say here, the Mishnah makes it sound like everything that applies on Shabbos also applies on Yom Tov, or the Yom Tov applies on Shabbos. The only difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov is Ochel Nefesh. Well, that's not true, because here you see a fundamental difference, how you lower produce, or if you can lower produce through a skylight on the roof. On Yom Tov you can, on Shabbos you can't. Rabbi Yosef lo kasha, ha Rabbi Eliezer, ha Rabbi Yoshua. This reflects two different opinions. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Mashilin Peros, alma gozru shvus al Shabbos lo gozru al Yom Tov. So the point over here is you see a shvus that Chazal have legislated by Shabbos that they did not legislate by. We'll see here. In other words, by Yom Tov you could push the produce down the skylight. Here the Beitzah indicates that you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. Which the Gemara says, but how does that stem with our Mishnah, which says that there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov except Ochel Nefesh? Which the Gemara says, two different opinions. This Sanya, here we go. This Sanya, the Gemara says, Osovias b'no shnafel lebar. We'll say we've referenced this case before. Let's say you have a mother and its offspring, the mother and the child, right? The animals that both fall into the pit. Now, both say, remember again, you're allowed to shecht on Yom Tiv, but you're not allowed to shecht a mother and its offspring animal on the same day. So now I have two animals in the pit. So what do I do? Rabbi Eliezer Omer Ma'alas Harishon Almanas L'Shochto. You could bring up one animal, whichever one you want, on the condition that you're going to shecht it. Right? So the tircha, the effort involved in raising the animal out of the pit, is legitimized because you're going to shecht it. But what about the second one? The second one, now once you get the first one out of the pit, Rabbi say, can you shecht the second one? Can you shecht the second one? No, because if I'm shechting the first, I can't shecht the second. So what do you do with the second? You lower food down to it and hopefully take care of it until Matzah Yom Tov and you can bring it out. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, listen to this. You could bring up the first animal on the condition, right, with the intention of slaughtering it. And then what happens when it gets up to the top, right? You'd say, you know what? Nah, I don't want to shecht this one. Let me see what the second one looks like. And then you could say, no, I changed my mind. I want to shecht the second one and bring the second one out of the pit. And whichever one you want, you can go ahead and shecht. So I will say, how does this line up? Take a look at Rashi just a moment. Rabbi Eliezer, Seifa diktani ein ben Yom Tov l'Shabbos, the choshavus the gazral Shabbos, gazral Yom Tov, va'afilu behefsid mamon. Rabbi Eliezer he shelo hiter lalos oso v'yesbenom mipnei hefsid mamon. So let's listen to this. So our Mishnah, which said there is no distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov, right? There is no distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Ultimately, again, that whatever shvus there is on Shabbos also applies on Yom Tov, would mean that you're not allowed to push the fruit down the skylight even on Yom Tov. That reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer would say, we don't allow you to do things just because you're going to suffer a financial loss. Vaharaya, we'll let you get one animal out of the pit, but not two. Choose which one you want to slaughter. That one you can get out of the pit. Vasheni, and the second one, lower food down to it. Hopefully it survives until the end of Yom Tiv. The second opinion, Rabbi Yoshua, who says that halacha l'maisa, you can get a both with a little harama, a little, what's the word? Yeah, I don't want to trickery sounds so terrible, right? Imagination, I think is the right word, right? A little imagination. He will say, why can you employ imagination? Because there's a hefsed, because there's a loss. So he would allow you to push produce down through the skylight on Yom Tiv in order to save yourself from a loss. That's how the Gemara wants to set it up. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. I'm going to Abaye. Dilma, Rabbi Eliezer Hassan Ela de Efshar Parnasa. Maybe not. It could be in the case of Osav one of the two animals. Rabbi Eliezer only allows you to bring one out of the pit because there's the ability to sustain the other by lowering food down to it. But maybe in the case of the produce, where if you don't get it off your roof, the produce is going to be ruined, maybe Enochinami Rabbi Eliezer would allow you to push it through the skylight. Furthermore, Rabbi Yoshua only allows you to do that. Why? Because there is some imagination to be had. But over here in the case of the fruit on the roof, there's really no imagination to be had. Maybe he wouldn't allow us. Therefore, both say that reconciliation doesn't work. Oh, the two opinions, one is Beishan, one is Beisal. Both say. So remember again, our fundamental machlokis over here is, do we say every shvus that applies on Shabbos applies on Yom Tiv? That's what the Mishnah said over here. Or do we hold like this Beitzah, which indicates to us that what? No. It could be that there are certain shvusin, certain dinei dirabanan, which apply on Shabbos that don't apply on Yom Tiv. For example, pushing the produce from the roof down the skylight, which the Gemara says it's a machlokes. Machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. This nan. Beis Shammai omrim ein motziin lo esakatin v'lo esalula v'lo esefer tolo sh'sarabim u'Beis Hillel matirin. Beis Shammai says that the license for ochel nefesh only applies to food, does not apply to anything else. So, for example, you can carry food, but you can't carry a child, and you can't carry your lulav, and you can't carry a sefer Torah. Whereas Beis Hillel permits it. If you look at Rashi says over here, ein motziin esakatin delo hutra otsa shelo l'tzorech. Just like Beis Shammai will only give a very limited view of Ochel Nefesh. They will also say that for financial loss, Chazal did not relax their standards by Yom Tiv. And therefore, again, the same way that the Shvos, you can't move the fruit drying on the roof on Shabbos, you also can't move it on Yom Tiv. Beis Hillel, on the other hand, the same way that he has a more relaxed stance by Ochel Nefesh, will also have a more relaxed stance by Shavusin on Yom Tiv. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. Dilmalohi, ad kalokar Beis Shammai hasam ela ha'otzah, aval tiltolo. Beis Shammai ultimately again was only machmir by hotzah, but maybe by carrying they would be mekel. To which the Gemara says that doesn't make sense, and I'll tell you why. Atu tiltol lav tzorach hotzahu. It will say anything that you're prohibited to carry or to move. What's the reason for it? Lest you come to an act of hotzah. So if Beis Shammai is going to be machmir in terms of what you're permitted to go ahead and carry, or I should say, what you're allowed to transport from one domain to another, they're going to be machmir on tiltul as well. Therefore, it turns out, Rabbosai, that this last approach works. And in fact, there is a machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai is of the opinion that any shvus which applies on Shabbos will apply on Yom Tiv. Beis Hillel says no. Whereas that's true most of the time, there are certain shvusin, certain dinei d'Rabbanan that Chazal relaxed on Yom Tiv, even though they are in full effect on Shabbos. An example of that, you spread out fruit to dry on your rooftop, it's about to rain, the fruit is going to get ruined. On Shabbos, what can you do? So remember, you could do something. What can you do? Cover it. Because we paskin, you can move a kli even to serve something that is moktzas. You could cover it, but you can't move it. But on Yom Tiv, you could push it down. Again, remember, there's limitations also. You can't start gathering it up in your hands, putting it into baskets, and take it to another rooftop, or lowering it through a window, or things like that. But you could push it down the skylight. That absolutely will work. Good. So it's a fundamental machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. We, of course, the Shulchan Aruch paskins like Beis Hillel. We paskin halacha l'maisa. You are permitted to push fruit down a skylight on Yom Tov. Again, it's a more involved halacha, but at least for our purposes, halacha l'maisa, we paskin. There is a distinction between the shvusin of Shabbos and on Yom Tov, and we paskin like Beis Hillel. Beautiful Mishnah. Ha behema v'kelim kraglei habaylim. Both is a great sugya. Behema and kelim are like the ragli habaylim, which is supposed to say this is a discussion now in the halachos of Tchum Shabbos, right? Tchum Shabbos, or for that matter, Tchum Yom Tov. There's a Tchum both cases. Also remember again, Tchum means you have 2,000 amas. We'll call it from the edge of your city, however you're measuring edge of city. You have 2,000 amas. Both say now we're going to get into interesting sugya that your stuff has your Tchum. Your possessions have your Tchum. Which both say we don't have time for it now because we only have 10 minutes. But you'll remind me, we'll come back to this hashkafic point that one's gashmios is an extension of himself, which is an incredible and profound yisod. My gashmios, what does it mean? My gashmios is my tchum. My gashmios is an extension of me, not in an unhealthy way. Not that my sense of self is rooted in my materialism, but ultimately, again, how I relate to my materialism is an extension of me. My possessions have my tchum. Again, we'll talk more about that. Therefore, if you give your animal to your child, to your son, let's say to your adult son, or you give your animal to a shepherd, so this is incredibly important. Because what's going to come out over here is if you lend something to someone on Yom Tiv, and let's say that person has a different tchum than you have, your object is limited, your possessions are limited to your tchum. Your tchum. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Let's say you have brothers who have shared ownership over some things. But one brother specifically always uses one thing. So the Gemara says, Hare'elu kirak love. So those possessions, even though technically speaking, there's joint ownership amongst all of the brothers, but if one of the brothers specifically uses this item, then Allah said that item has his tchum. Now, I'll say it's very interesting. What happens if you have something owned by a group of brothers? What's the tchum of the item? So we'll say we'll make it even more complicated. What happens if different brothers have different tchumin? If that's the case, you have an item that's jointly owned by brothers. But it doesn't have to be brothers; it's anyone, right? Items jointly owned by brothers, and the brothers had different tchumin. The object could only be moved where? In a common area. So wherever the overlapping area which all the tchumin share, that's the area in which the object is permitted to be moved. If you borrow something from your friend on Erev Yom Tiv, ultimately again, kiragle hashoel. Ultimately again, it is like the object has the tchum of the borrower. In other words, we'll say even though the borrower is not the owner, he's effectively the owner when he's borrowing it. He's a shoel, and therefore the object has his tchum. If you borrow something from someone on Yom Tiv, then ultimately, again, the object has the tchum of the owner. In other words, the tchum of the object, like every other tchum, is concretized or solidified when? At the onset. Ben Hashmash on Yom Tiv. V'china isha, it's very interesting. V'china isha sheshalom mechaberta, tavlin umelach umayim le'isasa, hare elu kiragle shtehen. This is fascinating. If a woman borrows ingredients, let's say to cook or to bake on Yom Tiv, what's the halacha? It sounds like what it's saying over here is that halacha l'maisa, the bread is limited to the tchum of the woman and from whom she borrowed the ingredients, right? Since the bread is a combination of things that belong to the woman and it's a combination of the ingredients that she borrowed, the bread itself can only be moved in an overlapping area of the tchumen. Incredible. Rabbi Yehuda quotes, Rabbi Yehuda says, if all you borrowed was water, then water is insignificant. Rabbi Yehuda says, halachically insignificant, and therefore, again, it won't impact the tchum. So we'll say, so bottom line, two important halachas over here. Number one, your possessions have your tchum. Number two, if you borrow something from someone on Yom Tiv, even though you are not the borrower, that object is limited by the owner's tchum. But if you borrow something on Erev Yom Tiv, then halacha l'maisa, that object has your tchum. Incredible. Says the Gemara, Masnisin, Amud Beis, Masnisin lo Rabbi Dosa. Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Dosa. How so? Rabbi Dosa Omer, v'Amr le'Abishol Omer, halokech behema mechaveira me'erev Yom Tiv. If you go ahead and you take an animal from someone on Erev Yom Tiv, even though it was not given over to the person on Yom Tiv. Let's say I purchased an animal Erev Yom Tiv, right? But it wasn't delivered, right? It wasn't delivered to me until Yom Tiv itself. Ultimately, again, that animal has the purchaser's tchum. Okay, so we'll say, so that's not such a chiddush, right? In other words, as long as I took title, right? As long as I took title, Erev Yom Tiv, even though I didn't get delivery until Yom Tiv, that object has my tchum. V'hamoser behema l'roa, here we go. And if you give your animal to a shepherd, afapi shelo masr lo ela b'Yom Tiv, even though, when did you give the animal to the shepherd? On Yom Tiv itself, harei hi kiragle haroeh. The animal has the tchum of the shepherd. Now, Bosai, this is a contradiction to the Mishnah. Because what did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said that if I give my animal to a shepherd on Yom Tiv, whose tchum does the animal have? The owner's tchum. Rabbi Dosa says if you give an animal to a shepherd on Yom Tiv, the animal has the shepherd's tchum. So our Mishnah clearly does not reflect the view of Rabbi Dosa. Maybe not. Afilu tim Rabbi Dosa. It could have been Rabbi Dosa. V'lo kasha, kan beroa echad, kan b'shnei roa. This is fascinating. Rabbi Dosa is talking about a case where there's only one shepherd. The Mishnah is talking about a case where what? There are two shepherds. What does this mean? Rabbi Dosa is talking about where I've got my shepherd. I've got my guy. I'm a one shepherd guy. I've got my shepherd. This is the person who shepherds my flock, which means I already know on Erev Yom Tiv what's going to happen on Yom Tiv. Who's getting that animal? The roa. Because I know that the roa is getting it, Rabbi Dosa says, okay, we know it's going to the shepherd on Yom Tiv, so it's effectively as if it already has been delivered to the shepherd, therefore it has the shepherd's tchum. The Mishnah's case is I have two shepherds, there's Reuven and Shimon. And again, both of them are great. Sometimes I use Reuven, sometimes I use Shimon. So in the absence of definitively knowing on Erev Yom Tiv who I'm delivering it to, the default setting is the animal has my tchum. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Kambara echad, she'ein be'ir ela roa echad, kol b'nei ir ma'amida behemta b'rshuso, v'niknis shvisaso. Hilchach bein moker bein melokeach, daitish lo tigna behem shvisaso, etzlo ela b'shvisas haroa. Umasnisin b'shnei roin, dilo yadinan lahai minayu havile das bailim. So again, a very simple distinction. Rabbi Dosa is talking about, I'm a one shepherd guy. There's one shepherd. This is the guy. So because I know the animal is going to my Yom Tiv, therefore the animal acquires a shepherd's tchum. The Mishnah's case is there's two shepherds. So we don't know we don't know who's going to shepherd the flock on Yom Tiv. Therefore the animal has the tchum of its owners. Incredible. Tekanami diktani. This seems to be implicit in the Beitzah. Diktani lebno o leroa. Right? You also remember again, the lashon of the Mishnah was you give your animal to your son or to the roa, which now the way the Gemara is kind of reading this is your son could shepherd it, the shepherd could shepherd it, right? So therefore, again, there's possibilities. So when there's possibilities and we don't know who you're going to give the animal to, the animal acquires the default tchum of its owner. Amra Bar Rabbi Yochanan, halach Rabbi Dosa. Good, Rabbi Yochanan says the halach was Rabbi Dosa, and therefore both say in a one shepherd scenario, even though you didn't give the animal to the shepherd until when? Until when? Until Yom Tiv itself, the animal would acquire the tchum of the shepherd. Rabbi Yochanan actually say this. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan, halacha kistam mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan said the halacha follows a stam mishnah. What did the stam mishnah say? Utnan habehima v'akil n'karagli abaylim. Well, so right, we have a stam. Our mishnah is a stam mishnah. A mishnah with that attribution. A mishnah with that attribution is always considered to be fundamentally authoritative. So therefore, the mishnah says that animals have the tchum of their owners. So that's it. So Rabbi Yochanan says halacha follows a stam mishnah. Animal follows the tchum of its owners. Why would he say the halacha? Why would he hold the halacha follows Rabbi Dosa? Says, okay, you're not paying attention. We just spoke about this before. The Mishnah's case is a case of two shepherds. Rabbi Dosa's case is a case of one shepherd. Rabbi Dosa is not arguing on the Mishnah. Therefore, again, Rabbi Yochanan could say both things. He could say that halacha follows the stam Mishnah, because our Mishnah is correct in a case of two shepherds. What's the halacha in a case of two shepherds? What's the tchum of the animal in a case of two shepherds? Owner's tchum. But he also follows Rabbi Dosa, which says that in a situation where there's only one shepherd, whose tchum does the animal get? Shepherd's tchum. Excellent. We'll say just go another minute. We'll say this is great. Two people borrow a garment. Reuven and Shimon, both they borrow together a garment from Levi. And what happens? One of them needs it Shabbos night to go to his Su'udah. The other guy needs it Shabbos morning to go for davening. I was going to say to go for Kiddush, but to go for davening, I think they do that first. Right, to go for davening. So what's the halacha? Ze arev alav b'tzafon, v'ze arev alav l'darim. We'll say, watch this. Both of them made an erev in a separate direction. So what's the halacha? The Gemara says, "Zeh sha'arav alav l'tzafon, mahalich l'tzafon k'raglei misha arav alav l'darim. V'zeh sha'arav alav l'darim, mahalich l'darim k'raglei misha arav alav b'tzafon." So we'll say, ultimately, and what's the halacha? We'll have to stop over here. The halacha is, it's actually kind of obvious. What can you do? Where could you move this article of clothing? Only in the area of overlapping tchum. In other words, we'll say, if you can imagine in this case, Ruvain made his tchum to go east, Shimon made his tchum to go west. They need to go in two different directions. The Gemara says, remember again, the object has the tchum of the people who own it. In this case, it's the borrowers who are the owners for this present moment, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, the item could only be moved in the overlapping tchum. V'im mitzvah, we'll just end with this, v'im mitzvah es ha-tchum, harei zeh lo yizizena mimkama. Then I will say that works fine as long as there's an area of overlap. What happens if there's no area of overlap? In other words, we'll say, let's say the home in which they both reside is literally, again, at the edge of the tchum. So Ruvain made his tchum 2,000 amos to the east, Shimon made his tchum 2,000 amos to the west, and there is no overlapping area. In that case, the garment would not be permitted to be moved at all. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Meretz Hashem with this case tomorrow. Shkach Avosai.